Hello, I'm Alex Penn, and I'm here representing myself and Erik to talk to you about both of our posters together. So agriculture, permaculture and terraforming, steering complex adaptive systems, and biological soil crusts as microbial prospects for terraforming. So creating and managing complex adaptive living systems like ecosystems is very hard. These are complex systems with interconnected components, nonlinear interactions between those components. So we get emergent properties, unexpected and nonlinear dynamics. And of course, these components or species within these systems adapt all the time in response to environment or to intervention, changing the rules of the games as we play it. So these are profoundly not static artifacts, complex ecosystems. They're not fully controllable or understandable in practice. And we work a lot on generating new approaches to engineering and manipulating these systems. And these new approaches they move away from the static machine paradigm to looking at how we can engineer and manipulate adaptive, dynamic living processes, which reconfigure in response to our intervention. And of course, I would say that terraforming, or creating closed socio-ecological systems on other planets which support human needs, these are really problems of the highest order in terms of creating, nurturing and steering functional, complex, adaptive socio-ecological systems. So they're very much the sort of highest pinnacle of what we might think about here. So we can learn something about how we might do this from looking at other attempts to create functional socio-ecological systems. So perhaps the most obvious is Biosphere 2, a closed ecological system that's supporting 8 people for 2 years. So this is a largely successful system, but the complexity and unexpected interactions between the biomes, the people and the physical infrastructure gave rise to problems such as very low oxygen levels. And they didn't really have the capacity to steer, reconfigure and work with that inevitable complexity and adaptation within the system. Other perhaps less obvious examples are agriculture. So these are the most ubiquitous systems really that we've created to provide for human needs, that we manage to provide for human needs. But current approaches to agriculture involve simplifying the system's dynamics with very high inputs of fertilizers and work such as ploughing, low species diversity, really trying to regularize the functions and outputs of these systems and impose control over them. So this gives us high yields, but this kind of low ecological complexity that this involves means that these systems have very little adaptive capacity. They're vulnerable to change, such as climate change or to difficult conditions. They're not very robust, and they require unceasing inputs and interventions, unceasing work. Or in the case of Biosphere 2, a more complex and system allowed to evolve, there was an underestimation of the inevitable complexity, but without levers in the system to allow us to steer it and make sure it continued to function for human needs. So in order to kind of find a way between these things, we look at iterative adaptive steering approaches which work with ecosystems' own dynamics. And some places we can draw inspiration from this are from approaches to constructing complex agricultural ecosystems in systems like permaculture or agroecology. And really one of the kind of key lessons here from permaculture is that what we need to do when we're working with complex ecosystems is to work with the system's own dynamics. These systems have their very powerful dynamics, behaviors that they will go through, and evolution that they'll go through themselves. So rather than just trying to push against those with a lot of energy to get the system to do what we want to take an Aikido approach where we work out what the system's doing and where exactly we want to intervene and touch the system such that its own momentum will move it to where we want it to be. So using the system's own capacity to do work, intervening intelligently is what we strive to do in working with these sorts of systems. And we also have certain sort of heuristics from these approaches for putting ecosystems together. So firstly, thinking of whole systems in all of their elements and all their functions. So all of the components in an ecosystem, species, they interact with each other, but they also affect their environment in different ways, creating niches for each other, which can support other species. So in this kind of approaches, we try to use the niches, think about elements and all their functions, use their niches to support the diversity of elements within the system and value and leverage the diversity. We also think about working with ecosystems' own dynamics. Ecosystems tend to go through successional processes. You have simple organisms which build conditions for others, colonizing bare ground. They build the soil, they build nutrients, they build environmental conditions for other species to come in. So each species, each set of species is creating the conditions for the next in the succession. So in these kind of systems like agroecology, we try to use and design successional processes rather than keep systems in early stages of succession, which conventional agriculture does. So kind of riffing off these ideas a bit, Erik in the Hom Lab has been working on the idea of looking at terraformation via microbial ecosystem seeding. So there has been quite a lot of suggestion by Lopez and others suggesting microbial first colonization. So that is leveraging microbes' capacities to engineer planetary environments and to provide ecosystem services as they have done and do on Earth. But they've suggested designing microbial consortia in advance and then monitoring and engineering in situ. We certainly think that's a good idea, but we think it'd be interesting in terms of working with the system's own dynamics to consider seeding with pre-existing microbial communities or ecosystem, which already play a role as ecosystem pioneers, enabling us to kickstart successional processes. So the candidates here are biological soil crusts. They're ecosystem pioneers in extreme habitats such as deserts. They're aggregated microbial communities of bacteria, cyanobacteria, fungi, and algae, which essentially function together cooperatively as simple ecosystems. They bring in carbon, nitrogen, and water to build bioavailable nutrients and hence kickstart successional processes. They inhabit very difficult conditions in deserts and survive extreme temperatures, highs and lows, desiccation and high radiation. So they're potentially good candidates for terraforming. So we have these biological soil crusts, which are self-contained microbial communities which fix carbon and nitrogen from the atmosphere for potentially kick-starting succession for higher organisms, and they are transplantable in their dry state and can be reactivated on command by adding water. So they are potentially something we could use to seed Martian surfaces. But obviously, if we were thinking about using these in terraforming, we'd have a lot of questions to answer. So how could we seed the terrain with soil crusts, and how could we accelerate their growth for terraforming? How could we modify these systems to operate in minimal atmosphere and produce oxygen? Could we potentially engineer in other bacterial species which provided lithotrophic sources of carbon and nitrogen? And really thinking from a steering perspective, we are not going to be there. We want to create autogenerative successional processes which we can potentially steer robotically, or potentially we farm there, but we want to be able to design biological soil crust seeds. What are the questions we need to answer? What communities would work and could be autogenerative in situ? Which communities are adaptable in context? Are these communities steerable? We do think we have certain ways to manipulate them and push them towards the functions we want in building bioavailable nutrient sources for succession. And we have to think about how we could steer them by changing their environmental conditions or by artificial selection in situ. Essentially, we have a lot of questions here. There's a lot of interesting work, but we're really thinking about how could we leverage these skins of the earth microbial communities in service to terraforming. And very crucially, as with all of this work, what could thinking about this kind of blue skies problem teach us for bioremediation and conservation purposes right now, as soil crusts are really crucial on Earth at the moment. I think the bigger picture for us is to think about how ecosystem steering approaches and this sort of philosophy more generally, and the ways you operationalize it, could fit with proposed terraforming strategies, and how might these steering approaches contribute here. There's lots of different ideas, and we'd love to talk to you about them and kind of brainstorm and think about that. And I think thinking about these kinds of ideas in these very challenging and sort of difficult contexts can be helpful here on Earth, because all of the global challenges that we work with and face are challenges of creating and managing complex adaptive socio-ecological systems. So there's a lot of learning that we can get from thinking about terraforming or creating other ecosystems far from Earth. And I think also more generally, it's possible that thinking about terraforming or terraforming in reality and using this more collaborative steering approach in which we work with ecosystems, maybe in the future that offers us the opportunity to redefine our relationship with ecosystems. And perhaps in future planetary colonization, we create new forms of socio-ecological system in which we collaboratively work with and interact with ecosystems. Perhaps there's a new, more positive vision there. So Erik and I, we work together in multiple contexts to develop and apply steering complex adaptive systems approaches to microbial systems, synthetic ecology, human microbe interactions, A-life, and myself, particularly in socio-ecological economic systems, including with stakeholders and policymakers on the ground. We'd really love you to come and talk to us at our poster session and discuss some exciting ideas. So here we are. Thank you very much. And that is the end of the talk.